Hello, everyone. My name is Kula, and I welcome you to our Data Protection for Nonprofits webinar. I'm glad you could join us today. So firstly, and this is generally how we like to start off our presentations, and I see a number of people are joining. So maybe I should actually just give a few moments just for everyone to join. Okay, good. Yeah, the numbers look good. A lot of people have joined us. So as I was saying, we like to start these things off by saying thank you for joining us. We value your time. We understand that your time is valuable, that you have a lot of time, that you have a lot of things on your plate, rather, that running a nonprofit is quite an involving thing, or being involved in the running of a nonprofit is quite involving. So the fact that you took this time aside and chose to join us means that you value data protection and that you want to learn about it. So thanks for joining us. So if you might not have heard, I just want to tell you just a little bit about me. As mentioned, my name is Stelo Kula, and I work at Michalsons Attorneys as one of the data protection attorneys here. As you can see there in the picture, I was doing a book launch with Dion Mayer. I'm just going to stop the video just so that we can all focus on the picture. I was doing a book launch with Dion Mayer in 2016, and that's very much linked to how I actually ended up working here at Michalsons, because at my core, I am a writer. And my journey to Michalsons is very much about wanting to take complicated ideas and explain them in simple ways. I have participated or helped a number of nonprofits in terms of reaching out to their beneficiaries, spreading messages about reading, creating a reading revolution where we increase the level of literacy in the country. And that is very much how my journey to Michalsons got charted. And as you can see in this other picture here, I've done a number of presentations specifically around this issue of data protection, whether it be in the context of nonprofits or just generally for other organizations. So I'm just going to back out of there. And then just tell you just quickly a bit about Michalsons. So Michalsons, one of the things that lies at the core of what we do is data protection compliance, helping organizations with that data protection compliance. And one of the things that lies, in fact, what lies at the core of doing that is we believe in making the law accessible, empowering, and helpful. And I find that messaging works quite well in the context of nonprofits, because the very reason why nonprofits exist is to be helpful, to fight for certain causes. And that's very much why we exist as well. And then in terms of handouts for the day, you'll see that there is a page that we have for this webinar that we're going to be looking at as we're talking through things. And that's the one thing. And then there's also a link to our Data Protection for Nonprofits program, which you'll find out more about as we go through the session today. Now, whenever we talk about data protection, and especially today, you'll find that we'll use various terms. We'll refer to data subjects, we'll refer to processing, processor, operator, controller. For some people, these might seem foreign, and it's always quite important just to get a basic grasp on what these mean. So this is part of what we'll be talking about today. So don't worry, I won't just throw these at you and expect you to know exactly what it means. And in terms of anything, any presentation that we do, we always want to know a bit more about you, because what inspires us is we definitely don't want this reaction from you. We don't want you to be like, why did I attend this thing? It's not relevant at all to me. It's something that someone else should maybe have attended. We definitely don't want you looking at your screens like this, and considering that it's not an in-person workshop. So at various points, we'll pause and I'll run a poll where you'll get a chance to answer, to respond to a question, and we'll just get to see maybe where you are in terms of your data protection and compliance efforts. And that was just really the sort of hello. And then in terms of an introduction, I think, but before we move on to the actual page on our website, just to give you a general idea of some of the things that we'll be looking at under the introduction. So what laws do nonprofits have to comply with in a data protection context? Do they even have to comply? And in terms of timelines as well, is it too late? So that's the broad framework around which we'll be talking in terms of the laws, the data protection laws. So I think we can just move right along to the website page for today's webinar. So I like this picture here that we've chosen for this page, because in my mind, as soon as I saw this picture and I chose it for this page, I thought it's a nice way of symbolizing exactly what, maybe not necessarily exactly, but just generally what data protection is all about. So I feel like this lock, the padlock and the bolt, in a way symbolizes or speaks to how data protection is about securing data. So you're securing something. The very point of having the padlock, of having the bolt, is that you want to secure something, you want to keep it in. Of course, data protection isn't just about locking data away and not using it at all. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to function. All sorts of organizations, not just nonprofits, would have to shut their doors and go out of business and not do anything if they couldn't use data. But the broad idea is just to be wary of security, that the need to protect it. Now, just in terms of what we're trying to achieve with today's webinar, we understand that maybe your first reaction in hearing about data protection for nonprofits is, does that even apply to nonprofits? Why should a nonprofit concern itself with data protection? Well, that's an important question. And the shortest of answers, as you can see here, around whether do you have to comply, is yes, your organization, your nonprofit has to comply. That's the short answer. And it's all tied to the processing of personal data. So in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve today, we're trying to raise your awareness, to point out some of these issues to you, to get you thinking about this if you weren't thinking about it already. And if you were thinking about it, to hopefully help shape some of that thinking, and see if there's any help that we can provide, which we definitely can. So that's very much what today's outcome is to get you walking away having a better idea of what you can do to improve your data protection compliance efforts, or to kickstart them. And part of doing that today is by telling you a bit about the Data Protection for Nonprofits program that we've created to help nonprofits exactly with this issue. So in terms of processing personal data in the context of a nonprofit, It happens in various ways, and this relates to that glossary that I showed you guys earlier. So when we say processing personal data specifically, it can include you collecting personal data from beneficiaries, collecting personal data from donors or from customers or any other businesses or organizations that you collaborate with. And then, of course, the act may be of storing that personal data, whether it's in hard copy format or it's in the form of digitally stored data. The point is that you're still processing it, even if you're just storing it and not necessarily accessing it or using it. So that's essentially what we mean when we talk about processing. And in terms of what laws you have to comply with, generally, especially if you're a South African nonprofit, which most of you probably are, POPIA is definitely right up there at the top of the list. But it extends beyond just the Protection of Personal Information Act, and also speaks to the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the GDPR, especially if, as a nonprofit, you're also processing the data of data subjects in the European Union, because then it means that you can't just focus on what POPIA requires. You also have to look at what the EU has in terms of any regulations that you have to comply with. An important consideration in looking at all of that is that global data protection laws are generally overlap and are quite similar. We found in our work that there's about a 70 to 80% overlap between these global data protection laws. So, for example, you'll find that GDPR and POPIA strike a very similar notes. You'll find that they cover similar areas using different wording perhaps, but you'll find that the effect is the same, or the requirements are the same. But importantly, there are also what we consider to be maybe about 30% in terms of differences between these two laws. And these differences generally comprise of extra compliance requirements. So you'll find, for example, that the GDPR, when compared to POPIA, has 20% in terms of extra compliance requirements. So when you break down that 30%, you'll find that it comprises of 20% extra compliance requirements that come from the GDPR. So if you're a person that is complying with POPIA, there will be that 70 or 80% that's common between POPIA and the GDPR, but then there will also be a 20% that's extra in the GDPR that isn't in POPIA, which you will have to consider in planning your compliance and understanding what your obligations are. Similarly, if you're complying with the GDPR and you're also looking at POPIA, you'll want to understand what's extra in POPIA and that isn't in the GDPR, apart from the things that are similar. So those are generally the considerations that go into understanding what laws you have to comply with. And then in moving on from that and looking at the timeline, whether it's too late to comply, again, the short answer there is no, it's not too late to comply. Even though the GDPR's commencement date it was the 25th of May 2018, if the GDPR applies to you, it doesn't mean that you've missed the ship and now you're stuck. It just means that you definitely have to get started sooner rather than later. And in fact, we would say the same with POPIA as well, even though the commencement date for POPIA hasn't actually been announced. The information regulator exists. There are sections in POPIA that establish the information regulator. Those sections have commenced, so the information regulator is staffed They're continuing to recruit more people. So it's definitely not seeming hopeless. It's not something that's only going to happen in 2030, maybe. It's certainly something that could happen within essentially the next year and a half or 2 years. It depends, really. It's hard to exactly put a fix on it. But the one thing that we like to point out to all organizations that we talk to about timelines is that there are already examples in our courts. One example that immediately comes to mind is the Black Sash case, which was heard before the Constitutional Court and related to the personal information of social grant beneficiaries, which are a group of beneficiaries that a number of nonprofits actually cater for in different settings. But yeah, in that case, the court, even though POPIA hasn't commenced, did firstly take into consideration the information regulators' input, and also looked at what POPIA says, and then combined that with what the common law already provides in terms of the right to privacy. And then we must always remember that there is a right to privacy under the Constitution. It's just that that right is so broad, it usually needs tools to help it be more fixed. And that's why the court was able to not only look at the input of the information regulator, but to actually look at the sections of POPIA, even though the law hasn't commenced, to say this is how the right to privacy should be understood in a data protection context. So it's very much possible for an organization to be held liable for failing to protect the data of data subjects. And this is especially important in the context of nonprofits, depending on what that nonprofit does. We found that nonprofits can have, again, depending on what they do, can have a lot of sensitive data. Think of nonprofits that focus on providing homes for children, for orphaned children who are HIV positive, or who have HIV positive parents who've been sexually abused, or whatever the case may be. You can immediately think that there's going to be a lot of sensitive personal information in there. And I mean, even perhaps less sensitive case where a nonprofit provides bursaries to learners. Again, it'll likely involve account numbers. Let's say maybe depositing the bursary funds into the account of a guardian. That again involves account numbers, and account numbers are a big deal under POPIA. So it's definitely not impossible to be held liable under the current framework, even though POPIA hasn't actually commenced. And that is generally what we like to communicate in terms of timelines for the GDPR and for POPIA. And then in terms of understanding what the impact of data protection laws is on organizations generally, and then nonprofits specifically, it's always important, and this is again one of our key messages, is that it's important to look at activities, to look at what an organization does that data protection can have an impact on, that data protection laws can apply to. And nonprofits, we found, have various activities which set them apart from other organizations when it comes to data protection. They're different. A nonprofit's activities are different enough to make it necessary for us to say that there needs to be a different approach. But even though how a nonprofit approaches data protection compliance may be different from how a large organization approaches data protection compliance, it still doesn't mean that a nonprofit will necessarily have to comply any less. But I think before we go any further with talking about the different activities and the impact that data protection laws have on that, I think I just want to run a poll. Just based on the last section that we covered, which is around the laws and timelines. So I'm just going to launch the poll and just give people an opportunity to view it and vote. Okay, looking good. A lot of people are voting. We're halfway there. I'm just going to give it a few more moments just to give everyone a chance to vote. But so far, most people indicate that they have at least read the GDPR and POPIA. Okay, just a few more seconds. If the people who haven't voted yet could just have a quick vote on the poll. Okay, I think I'll stop it now. So as you can see, and this is quite good, that more than that at least 50% of the people that voted, out of them, they've read at least more than half of the GDPR and POPIA, which is very good. And it's quite promising. But of course, even like the people that haven't read it or that have read less than half of it, it's not a train smash, because ultimately you are here today. So I wouldn't say that just because you've read less than half of it or you haven't read it, that you don't care about data protection. Again, I mean, I understand that you're quite busy is the one thing. And then we often find that with laws, the way they're drafted is not necessarily always reader friendly. So it can be a bit cumbersome, it can be unwieldy. You can look at the law, which could be anything up to, let's say, anything between 50 pages and 100 pages or more. So it can be quite scary and it can be quite an undertaking. So we understand that not all people have read it or have read more than half of it. I'll just stop sharing the results. Okay, so we were talking about the different activities of nonprofit organizations. Now, in terms of the various activities, I did say that a nonprofit has activities that set it apart from a lot of organizations. And we've provided a brief list here of some of the things that we think some could be similar to other organizations, but others do set a nonprofit apart. The one, and this is one of the key activities of a nonprofit, and that is you source funding from donors. And I say it's key because I don't really see a nonprofit being able to do its work, to continue its work, if it doesn't receive funding. Funding is an important pillar upon which the work of a nonprofit rests. So that's definitely one thing. And then the other thing is a nonprofit has beneficiaries. You have a group of beneficiaries that you interact with. You exist for a reason, to achieve a particular aim, and that often revolves around benefiting a certain group of society. It may be that it extends beyond that, and it isn't necessarily about benefiting people. It may be about it may be about nature conservation or whatever the case may be. But across the board, we tend to find that there is a group of beneficiaries that you interact with. And in interacting with that group of beneficiaries, in sourcing funding, what you are very much doing is collecting and storing and accessing deleting, but basically processing personal information. And moving on to other activities like employing people or collaborating with other nonprofits or other organizations, you're exchanging data. You may be selling goods or providing services in order to raise funds, just apart from sourcing funding from donors. And this is quite a common occurrence of even the nonprofits that I've worked with tend to sell things or provide services in order to raise funds. Or it may be that you receive goods and services from suppliers and you exchange personal information in that setting. And it's important, of course, to remember that even though the GDPR doesn't apply to the personal information or personal data of companies, POPIA does. POPIA says that a company is capable of having personal information or personal data. So in that sense, when you interact with your suppliers who aren't necessarily people, but are a company, you are processing their personal data. And that's, again, what we state here. That is, you collect, analyze, sort, amend, store, and delete personal data while getting these activities done. But of course, it's always important, and this is something that is part of why we feel so inspired to help nonprofits with data protection compliance, and that is you process personal data in order to protect people, to enrich their lives, and maybe even to repair the harm that those people have already suffered. So that's something that is actually, it aligns with why data protection laws exist in the first place as well. It's to ensure that whenever organizations, for example, process personal data of data subjects, they do it in a lawful way, in a responsible way, a way that considers the importance of that personal information and the need to protect it. And then a very key concept in terms of looking at the activities is what we call mapping activities. And that is the concept of not just being fixated on the kinds of personal information that you process and where that information is going, but to actually look at the activities that result in you processing personal information, which is what we've just discussed now. And then in terms of the kinds of personal data, again, it's where you may collect the personal data of your donors, for example, when you want to seek funding from them, or when you actually get the funding and maybe keep a register of the donors. It's unlikely that you're receiving funds from donors and not keeping records of who donated what and who the person is and when they donated that, and maybe other bits of data around that person or that organization that donated to you. And also, which this is quite important as well, is that you'll seek funding from new donors using direct marketing to reach them. You'll also collect financial data such as the bank details of your employees, collaborators, or suppliers. I mentioned this earlier, but I also didn't mention how in the context of employing people, you're likely going to be processing their account numbers, because obviously you need to pay your employees salaries unless there's maybe another way in which you remunerate them for their services. But very likely you will be paying them, and in order to pay them, you'll need their account numbers. And as I mentioned earlier, account numbers are a big deal under POPIA. So what lies at the core, or what is important about the concept of mapping activities, is that ultimately you want to understand what the impact of data protection law on your organization is. And in our minds, when trying to understand the impact, you're going to fall into one of three categories. The data protection laws or data protection law is either going to have a low impact on your processing activities, a medium impact, or a high impact. And depending on where you are, you'll see, as we talk about actions to take or quick wins, it'll then determine what is important for you in terms of the actions that you need to take, depending on the impact that the data protection laws have. So we see there, we say, the more sensitive the nature of the personal data that you use during your activities, the more risk it can potentially attract to your organizations. This means that there's a difference between a nonprofit organization that provides warm soup to random members of the public without collecting the personal data, without collecting their personal data, and a nonprofit organization that collects, for example, the health data of its beneficiaries. Of course, just considering the concept of low, medium to high impact, you can immediately see then that data protection laws will have a low impact on the organization, the nonprofit that serves out warm soup to random members of the public, because you can imagine you just stop a bakkie somewhere, you pull out a big pot of warm soup, and you call strangers to come and get a serving of that soup. You haven't at any point collected the personal data. But then if, for example, as part of serving that soup, you pull out registers and you want people to fill in information that you can then collate and put onto your systems or keep somewhere in some storage cabinet, then you've gone beyond just that initial step of not processing any data. And of course, with that, the impact of data protection laws might have shifted depending on what data you collected. It might have now moved from low impact to medium impact, or even to high impact, again, depending on the sensitive nature of that personal data or personal information. And then in terms of actions that you need to take, we distinguish between actions to take first and quick wins. We find that it's important to make this distinction, especially because organizations often cite a number of challenges that they have in achieving data protection compliance. They'll speak about lack of executive buy-in. They'll speak about lack of resources, not having enough budget. So then it's important to prioritize the things that you have to do regardless of price, regardless of cost, and then things that you can do easily without having to invest a lot in getting them done. And that's exactly what the distinction is. Actions to take first are actions that might be very involving. They might involve having to bring in an external consultant. They might involve the person in your organization who is responsible for ensuring your data protection compliance, having to start a project, having to spend time, having to allocate resources, pull in other employees in the organization, in the nonprofit organization, to spend time and looking at this issue. Now, it's not easy, but it's necessary. And that's where the distinction lies. And I just want to quickly look at what some of these actions to take first may be. Now, depending again on what laws apply to you, if the GDPR applies, you'll find that, and of course, depending on whether you fall within the criteria set out in the GDPR for organizations that have to appoint a data protection officer. A data protection officer, just briefly, is almost like the equivalent, is basically the equivalent of the information officer under POPIA. So this is an issue that a lot of organizations have struggled with, and they haven't been sure about whether the GDPR requires them to appoint a data protection officer. So that's why we consider it to be an action to take first, because you want to know sooner rather than later whether you have to appoint a data protection officer. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the webinar that we found that the GDPR has various extra compliance requirements that POPIA doesn't have. And one of these is around the appointment of a data protection officer, because under POPIA, it's an information officer is assigned by default as being the head of the organization, the CEO, the managing trustee, or whoever falls under that category of being a head of the organization. But under the GDPR, there's an extra step that you have to now take, which is you have to determine whether you have to appoint a data protection officer. And then if you do have to appoint one, then there is that extra step of bringing the person on board. So that's one of the actions that you might have to take first, depending again on whether the GDPR applies to you. And then other actions that I just want to quickly mention that I think are key: planning your incident response or breach management. This is often in the form of a policy called an incident response policy that sets out what you would do in the case in case there's a breach of the personal data or personal information that you process. So imagine that your servers get hacked and then a bunch of personal information is then stolen. What do you do? How do you respond to that? How do you investigate that? Who is responsible? Who's the person within your organization that is going to set out to fix things, maybe to let the information regulator know? Because that's one of the important things that's set out in POPIA. Even in the GDPR, it's set out that you have to let a supervisory authority know if there is a breach. So that kind of policy would then set out what you have to do or what you would do in such a scenario. So we talk about these kinds of actions as being the actions to take first. You can imagine from what I've already explained that they're quite involving activities that go beyond just this webinar, where you actually do have to sit down and think about it a bit more, investigate, talk to people really. And in that sense, it's not easy, but it is something that's quite important. Now, it may be that out of this list of actions to take first, only some apply to you. For example, it may be that having a complaints procedure is more important in your case because, and in fact, it's important in the context of many, if not all organizations, or most, if not all organizations, because, and the idea behind it is you would rather data subjects come to complain directly to you than going to the information regulator or going to a supervisory authority. You wouldn't want, as a nonprofit, to have a bad reputation, to have the reputation where people out there know that you don't have enough regard for their personal information, because of course it might very well chase away donors, potential donors. I don't really see a donor that's going to come on board and donate money to a nonprofit that presents various legal risks, that presents various governance issues. So from that perspective, then, something like a complaints procedure might be something you want to investigate and think about after this webinar. It might be one of those actions that you have to take first. And then these are just the various other actions to take first. Another one which might be worth mentioning is privacy by design. This concept that at the beginning of every project that you want to run, you want the person that's responsible in your organization for helping you with data protection compliance to sit down and think about how that project will impact data protection, will impact the processing of personal information in a significant way. So for example, if a project that you're setting out to do will involve processing a lot of account numbers, will involve processing a lot of health data, you want to then sit down and look at any mechanisms that you can build into that project that you can plan at the very beginning to avoid, first of all, maybe to minimize how much data you're going to be processing as part of that project. So maybe ask yourself at the beginning of a project, hey, I have 10 lists here that contain personal information that I could use this as part of this project. But do I really need to have this list? Do I really need to have these names? Do I really need to have all of this personal information? Will it help me achieve the purpose of this project? That's only one of the questions that you'd need to ask yourself if you are trying to achieve privacy by design. So that's why, again, we say that these are actions to take first, and they'll be hard, they won't be easy, but they're quite important in the bigger scheme of things or in the long run. But just moving past actions to take first, there are also quick wins, which, as we said, are like the low-hanging fruits. These are the actions that you can take relatively quickly without necessarily having to expend a lot of resources, without necessarily having to spend a lot of time doing them. And these may include, for example, having a good privacy policy, looking at your website and seeing if there is a privacy policy in place that tells people outside your organization how and why and when you intend to process their personal data. We do have a free template, for example, which I'll quickly open for you. We do have a free template that is bare bones, but sets out to help you at least communicate at a very basic level what or how you'll be processing people's personal information, or why you'll be processing people's personal information. And as you can see here, there are other free terms such as terms of use or terms of sale, which aren't really related to what we're discussing here. For the purposes of today, it's the free privacy policy that matters more and that you're likely going to be more interested in. So I think we can move past that. And then there is also Whitefuse's template for charities as well, which you can have a look at on this page. And it just talks around talks about the thinking around privacy policies and privacy notices, and then does also then provide you with a template that you could use. And then one key quick win as well is to make sure that you use appropriate tools like mass mailers and CRMs for sending communications like your newsletter. And this harkens back to that issue of needing to communicate to the public, to communicate to donors or potential donors to try and seek funding or source funding. So you want to do that in a way that doesn't infringe or doesn't or isn't lawful, basically. And these are some of the tools that you can use: MailChimp, Infusionsoft, Clickatel, or Everlytic. Because one of the issues that a lot of organizations often encounter when it comes to direct marketing is this issue of spamming people, of sending people messages that aren't relevant, not having a target audience, not targeting people in the right way, and also where people, for example, have opted out, and yet the organization still persists in contacting those people. So those various things, or for example, you're emailing and you end up showing the email list accidentally, which means that a person receiving that email that you sent can see the email addresses of a number of other people. So it's quite useful then to try and structure or try and do it in a better way using some of these tools. And number 3, having a lawful purpose. We've definitely touched on that at various points, and it's quite an important thing. It relates to just making sure that whenever you process personal data or personal information, there's a reason. There's a lawful reason at that for why you're processing that personal data. So just because you want to sell the personal data that you've somehow gotten your hands on, you want to sell that and make money, that's not a lawful purpose necessarily, but wanting to reach out to your beneficiaries and help them, that is right along the lines of a lawful purpose for processing personal data. And another quick win, and this one, depending on who you talk to, is very easy, and that is having a shredder just to make sure that you take care of hard copies of personal information. So think, for example, in your recruiting activities where you get new employees on board, you want to make sure that those people's CVs, if you have hard copies of those CVs, that you shred it as soon as you don't need it anymore, and that even when you do still need it, you keep it in a secure way. Let's say you have a storage cabinet that is locked, and only the people that need to have access to it do have access to it, and not just anyone that works at your nonprofit. So, for example, only the key decision makers that are involved in the recruitment process, HR, have access to that storage cabinet to view those CVs and anything that's in there related to those potential employees or to those employees. So that's one of the things that we recommend. Then you shred the hard copies of that personal data when you don't need it anymore. And again, you can see 5, it's point number 5. It's exactly what I mentioned now, just ensuring that paper-based personal data is secure in locked storage cabinets or rooms, and that you even control the access to the facilities. So making sure that you have good offices that can be locked. You have a security company maybe that comes around, patrols the area just to make sure that no one breaks in. Those kinds of things. And then also, and this is something that a lot of people take for granted, and that is using strong passwords and then storing them in a place where you won't lose them and they'll be secure. Now here at the office, a tool that we use quite often is LastPass, and it's a very useful tool because it provides you with a central location for you to keep your passwords. And then there is that one password, that master password that you use to access LastPass. So it's quite a useful tool that we use. And then point number 7 is putting up effective firewalls around your digitally stored personal data, installing the latest antivirus software, encrypting your drives. And at the office, we even have a list of all the computers, of all the laptops, the phones that could or do have access to personal data. And we've made sure that people encrypt them. And that's one way of making sure that everyone at the office is acting in a responsible way. And now in terms of next steps beyond this webinar, and this is now basically consolidating the different things that we've discussed up until this point. And it relates also to what we talked about, which is the impact of data protection laws and how it can either be low, medium, or high. So if you're a small nonprofit and you don't process much personal data, you can actually get by just doing the quick wins. and not necessarily doing the actions to take first, because you likely have a lot of constraints, budget constraints, lack of resources, and also taking into consideration the fact that you don't process much personal data. Doing the quick wins can actually work for you. But of course, if you're a small nonprofit, but you process a lot of personal data, then just doing the quick wins isn't enough. Then more is involved in order to get you to a point where you are compliant. I think I just want to pause at this moment and just look at any other polls that I'd actually prepared. So the one poll is around what you think, or where you think the biggest impact, where data protection laws will have the biggest impact on you. And I'm just going to launch that poll. So if you could just quickly have a look at it and vote. And I think at this point, just apart from voting here, I also just want to mention that if you have any questions as well, please do ask them. Depending on the complexity of the question, we may answer it here, or we may have to take it offline and answer it after the webinar. Again, just depending on the complexity of the question. But please do ask if you have any questions. Looking good. A lot of people have voted. I'll just give it a few more moments just to let those that haven't voted yet to vote. Okay, I think let me end it. Now, what I did with this one, with this poll, is I allowed people to vote not just for one option, but a number of options, because I understand that just because donor personal information is an area that data protection laws will have a huge impact on, doesn't mean then that there aren't other areas. And it's quite interesting to look at the spread here. Some do definitely indicate that that donor personal information is one area they're concerned about, and the biggest, and this again indicates what we've been talking about, and that is beneficiaries' personal information. That's a huge area. So we have a question here. So the question is, I think before I answer and tell you what the question is, and just let me just stop sharing. So thank you, firstly, Ezra, for asking the question. It's quite an interesting one, because there are a number of ways of approaching data protection compliance. Like, one of the things that we've done is a gap analysis, where we come to your organization and we look at your different activities, again, in line with that whole concept of mapping activities. And based on what you do and what the impact of data protection laws is, then we start looking at your obligations and breaking them, your obligations in terms of data protection laws that apply to you. And then we break that down into actionable items. So we look at each division or each part of your organization, and we say, HR, these are the 10 things, or HR, these are the 15 things that you need to do in order to improve your compliance. So I see there's another question here. Yes, we definitely will provide a copy of not only this page, but also just a link to the Data Protection for Nonprofits program homepage as well. Okay, glad I could answer that for you, Ezra. It's one of those questions where there are a number of answers, and a gap analysis is only one aspect of it, really. It's again, it relates back to what I said, which is that the complexity of the questions, it's possible to answer maybe part of it, but not necessarily the whole thing. But then I just quickly now want to show you what I was talking about with regard to the Data Protection for Nonprofits program. So this is a program that we've put together just as a step beyond attending this webinar and getting some of the basics around data protection. It takes some of the insights that we've shared with you today a step further and delves into a bit more detail. And it's linked to our larger program, but we've made sure that this one is focused primarily on nonprofits, so that you don't, when you join it, you don't learn about things, or you don't take actions that you don't actually need to take, actions that are actually meant for larger organizations. So that's where this program came from. And you'll see there, it's about protecting the most vulnerable in society, and how protecting their personal information is connected to that. And again, just I think because we've already talked about all of this stuff and the various activities that set nonprofits apart, I think I just want to show you firstly the outcomes. So these are the outcomes that we broadly want to achieve, what we want to help you achieve when you join this program. And that is complying with data protection laws that apply to your nonprofit, protecting people from harm by protecting their personal data, putting the necessary controls in place, and then reducing the risks of non-compliance. Because as we've mentioned at various places, there definitely are risks to not complying, one of which is reputational damage, where you get the reputation as a nonprofit that doesn't care about protecting personal data. And maybe in that way, you push away potential donors and you end up having to close your doors. So I am the instructor primarily for this program. And if you do join, then you'll definitely be seeing more from me. And again, just in terms of why Michalsons, we definitely believe in using the law as a tool to prevent harm. We have a lot of experience in this area of the law, and we want to only present the law in a way that's relevant, practical, and simple, and doesn't involve you spending a lot of money and time and effectively wasting it. And then actually what I did want to get down to, and that is the program outline. So the program outline, one of the first modules, and how the program will work is that the first module, the introduction to data protection, will be a live module where, and it's meant to start on the 2nd of May this year. It'll be a live module, and then it'll introduce you in a bit more detail into the laws that apply to you and how they apply to you. And then we're going to talk about a bit more about what data protection involves, the risks of non-compliance, and the different relationships that are involved. You'll remember that I've mentioned suppliers, customers, employees, donors, so just covering that in a bit more detail. And then the really important aspects of it, which is actually planning your compliance. So planning what you will do. So we would be delving into that in much more detail. And again, also another really important one, and that is protecting the personal data that your nonprofit processes, actually taking action, identifying the different things that you can do for your nonprofit and then doing them, and being able to have access to us and asking us questions offline, just apart from this webinar now. I see that, so I'll just pause there. I see that there are more questions. Okay, I see Paul Rankin here has asked, how do we handle third-party information? We are a school advisory organization who has contact details provided by schools to us to communicate to those people directly. This is an issue that often occurs where it's not clear what role you're playing, whether you're the operator or whether you're the responsible party. So think of it like this, for example, where you're doing something on behalf of someone else and you're not determining why that personal data needs to be processed, then you're essentially acting as an operator, and then the responsibility to protect that data lies on the responsible party. But of course, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that you should do, but often it means that the responsibility isn't on you unless there's some sort of contract where you are required to then protect that personal data. And thanks, Claudette, for the feedback. Claudette just says, no question, just a sincere thank you for the great information and the way you presented it. Thanks a lot for that. So I just want to really quickly now go past this. And another important module is sustaining your compliance, because apart from actually taking action, planning it, and taking the action, you need to sustain it. You need to occasionally look at what you've done and try to improve on it. But I just want to go back now to the webinar page and just talk around the useful links and resources. So you'll see here that we've spent a bit of time just looking at different places and trying to find a whole lot of useful links and resources for you, because we definitely do believe that you can find a lot out there. It's just, it's useful to get someone to consolidate all of that in one place and present it to you so that you can have access to it. And when you do get the link to this page, you'll be able to go to the different places and have a look at what they've presented for you. So I think maybe I can just open one of them. So for example, Open Democracy has this guide here talking around POPIA, just explaining what the law is, why it's important. And the benefit about it is, again, it's geared towards nonprofits. So it's not irrelevant. It's the opposite, actually. Again, it talks about important issues such as special personal information as opposed to personal information and what that is. And just delving into a lot of detail for you, just presented in a simple and understandable way. And it's one of the many guides out there that you can use. And it's not to say that because you have this guide, you can then use it as some sort of substitute for taking any action. This is one of the tools that you can use in order to advance your data protection compliance efforts. And one of the places that we often send people to is the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the UK supervisory authority for data protection. And they also have quite a useful guide here, we think. and it talks around the GDPR. So if the GDPR applies to you, then you'd want to read something like this in addition to any other guides that you read, or joining the program as well, joining our Data Protection for Nonprofits program. I just want to, I see that we've actually gone a bit over the time that had initially been set aside, but that's not a bad thing. It means that there certainly was a lot to talk about, and that we've looked at it. And I hope really that attending the webinar was useful for you. So in terms of actions, again, the one important action that you can take is to join our Data Protection for Nonprofits program, and then also just to prioritize data protection implementation actions by identifying what your organization's actions to take first are, and actually taking them, and then scoring the quick wins that we've spoken about as well. So I think on that note, we should end it here. But again, I just wish to thank you for attending and taking this time to come and join us. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from you guys again. It just seems like there might be another question here. Okay, no, that's just Paul saying thanks. Maybe I should just check. Is there any other question maybe that you haven't gotten to ask? Okay, let's just see. Okay, I'll unmute you, Claudette, and we'll just. Hi, Claudette. Claudette, hi. There seems to be an issue with Claudette coming through. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, fine. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it just tremendously. I just want to know about the costs. You know, as NPOs, we're always asking first, what are the costs if we join the program? Is there a charge, and can you email that charge, you know, to what it's going to cost to actually join the program?
Yes. So the information is always provided on the program page, but it basically it's 6,000 including VAT, and it's a once-off fee for lifetime access to the program.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sure.
And thanks for a great webinar. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks a lot for the feedback. Okay, guys, I think I'll end it on that note. Thanks a lot. Cheers.